Okay, so good afternoon to everybody. I'm Maria Dele Carrai, and I'm an assistant professor in Global China Studies at NYU Shanghai and a fellow at the Asia Center here, a lucky fellow here. And on the behalf of the Harvard University Asia Center and the Harvard University Center for African Studies, I extend a warm welcome to each of you to this conference on Africa-Asia relations, its status and possible trajectories. So with Africa's immense potential and the increasing engagement of Asian countries in the continent, in particular China, in the past few decades, it is vital for us to come together to understand, explore, and shape these intricate dynamics. This conference is not just about discussion, but is about seeking alternative avenues of exchange and transformation, and about embracing the next and past global realities beyond some of the traditional paradigms that have been used to look at this relationship. And I'm truly delighted that we have experts from diverse fields joining us to shed light on this complex Africa-Asia relations. And I'm certain that their insights will enrich our understanding and provoke thought-provoking discussions. And now, to kick off our conference, it's my pleasure to introduce a figure who has greatly contributed to our understanding of African history and its intersections with broader global dynamics. He's a leader in his field, a source of inspiration to many, and a pillar in the academic community here at Harvard. Professor Emmanuel Akyeampong. Professor Akyeampong, the Ellen Gurney Professor of History and Professor of African and African American Studies, has been instrumental in creating the Department of African and African American Studies here at Harvard, and served for many years as the Oppenheimer Faculty Director at the Center for African Studies. His extensive research, publications, and unwavering commitment to knowledge dissemination have made a significant impact in the realm of African and African American studies, academia, and beyond. Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, I invite Professor Akyeampong to give his opening address. Professor Akyeampong, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Adele. So good afternoon to our speakers, panelists, and audience. It is an honor to be asked by the Harvard University Asia Center to deliver the welcome remarks for this important conference. My appreciation to my colleague and friend, James Robeson, Faculty Director of the Asia Center, and to Tenzin Ngodop for pulling together this wonderful program, together with all those who have worked with him. My name is Emmanuel, as Adele pointed out, and I'm a professor of history and of African and African American Studies. I stepped down at the end of June as faculty director of the Center for African Studies after a period of 7 years, but then I guess my colleagues decided I have time, so many other things came onto my table. I have been a China watcher for the better part of the last 2 decades, drawn initially to China's resource-backed infrastructure loans to African governments that offered the opportunity of closing Africa's huge infrastructure deficit that had undercut developmental efforts. I organized perhaps the first China-Africa event at Harvard in 2007, a panel discussion combined with a book launch of Chris Alden's then recently published book on China in Africa. So this is in 2007. The panel included Chris Alden and Dwight Perkins, a very distinguished professor of political economy and now emeritus at Harvard, and a former director of the Fairbanks Center. It was a great opportunity to hear about the growing importance of China from an Africanist perspective provided by Chris, and to learn from Perkins how infinitesimal Africa was to China's global trade. Africa-China trade and broader economic relations have continued to grow. I was appointed faculty director at the Harvard Center for African Studies in 2016. One of the programs being discussed then was the China-Africa Initiative, and Arthur Kleinman, then faculty director of the Asia Center, played a leading role. And when I became faculty director, I encouraged us to make this a wider Africa-Asia initiative at Harvard, aware of the important roles that India and Japan have also played in the history of Africa. Indian mercantile presence in East Africa goes back to the 18th century, as scholars like Pedro Machado has documented in his book Ocean of Trade. After British abolition of slavery, Indian indentured workers came to work on sugarcane plantations in Natal, and today Durban is the largest Indian city outside of India. The late Belfer provided an excellent examination of the Indian working class in Durban in his book Insiders and Outsiders. Japan has an equally long and important place in African history. Japanese medical scientist Dr. Hideo Noguchi died in Ghana in 1928, conducting research into yellow fever. In 1979, the government of Japan, courtesy of Japan International Cooperation Agency, or JICA, built the Noguchi Memorial Institute for Medical Research and gave it as a gift to the government and people of Ghana. It is JICA's support that has transformed the Jomo Kenyatta University of Agriculture and Technology, which we call JKUAT, in Nairobi, into a leading institution in fields such as computer science and in electrical and electronic techniques. Even the Korea Institute at Harvard got excited when I spoke about the prominence of Korean electronics, appliances, cars, and trucks in Africa, and how South Korea provided the most Christian missionaries to Africa next to the United States. And so that was a fact the Korea Institute was not aware of. So a larger Asia-Africa initiative was born at Harvard, and it included the Asia Center, the Fairbanks Center, the South Asia Institute, the Reischauer Institute, the Korea Institute, the East Asia Legal Studies Program at the Harvard Law School, the Harvard China-Africa Health Network at the School of Public Health, and the Center for African Studies. On November 16th, 17th in 2017, the Asia-Africa Consortium at Harvard hosted an international conference at the Harvard Center in Shanghai. The theme was Africa-Asia Connections, Bridging Past, Present, and Future. Scholars and policymakers from China, Japan, and India were in attendance, with keynotes given by two economists, Justin Yifu-Ling from Peking University, and Celestine Monga, who was then the chief economist at the African Development Bank. Our funders expanded to include the Harvard Yenching Institute and the Harvard China Fund. A follow-up conference in March 2019 in Johannesburg focused on Africa-Asia partnerships in health and healthcare delivery for women and youth. The keynotes were delivered by the late Dr. Paul Farmer and Dr. Tsepo Motsipi, the First Lady of South Africa, an alumna of the Harvard School of Public Health. This conference included representatives from South Korea, expanding the Asia-Africa nexus at Harvard. We also hosted exciting opportunities and events at Harvard, and one memorable one was when Jamie Monson from Michigan State University came to give a public lecture here on April 2018 on futures in the past of Africa-China engagement. With this blossoming of Africa-Asia relations at Harvard, I was receptive to the invitation of Professor Elizabeth Perry of the Harvard Yenching Institute to design a training program on Africa and Asia that would bring Asian doctoral fellows and postdocs to Harvard for a deeper immersion in African studies. I designed the training program in African history and cultures, which I have co-led with Professor John Mugani, the director of the African Languages Program, since 2019. We have brought 2 cohorts, a total of 8 scholars from Japan, China, and India to Harvard in 2019, 2020, and in 2022 to 2023. This program includes a 10-day field trip to East Africa, an area replete with Indian, Chinese, and Japanese presence and investments, and a region of Africa that has long been part of the Indian Ocean world. And I think we have a couple of people here who have been fellows in this program. The Asia-Africa relationship has clocked several significant milestones. China and India have gone from being exporters of indentured labor to South Africa in the 19th and early 20th centuries to becoming the first and the third largest trading partners of Africa, respectively. China's trade increased from $1 billion in 2000 to $55 billion by 2007, with 800 Chinese companies operating in 49 African countries. In 2009, China surpassed the World Bank as Africa's top lender and became Africa's leading trading partner. China's trade with Africa stood at $182.5 billion in 2018. In 2017, McKinsey estimated that there were about 10,000 Chinese companies operating in Africa. India's trade with Africa has gone from $965 million in 1991 to $35 billion in 2008. In 2018, India's trade with Africa stood at $79.6 billion, making India Africa's third largest trading partner. India imports about 70% of its oil from Africa. These significant developments mirror the seismic shifts in global trade. In 2019, let me step back. In the 1980s, 85% of Africa's primary exports went to OECD countries in the 1980s. In 2019, the global South accounted for 50% of Africa's trade, and the South accounted for 57% of global trade. These shifts have been reflected in the literature. To take that on China and Africa, we have gone from state-centered perspectives with a focus on infrastructure and the extractive industries to an examination of private investment and labor relations in Chinese companies in Africa. After all, the McKinsey report of 2017 that estimated that there were 10,000 Chinese companies in Africa also indicated that 90% of these companies were privately owned, a third in manufacturing. We have studies by Qingquan Li, Zhu Liang, and others looking at the conduct of business and labor relations of Chinese private investment in Southern Africa. The Chinese state and private companies have become interested in technical and vocational training to equip African workers for the numerous Chinese companies in Africa, an area of research for Eugene Zhu, one of our recent CAS Harvard Yenching fellows from China. We have seen rather sensational accounts of Chinese immigration, including one that described Africa as China's second continent. On the reverse, we are seeing increasing studies of Africans in China, though this seems to remain in the infancy. I have no doubt that the literature on China and Africa will continue to flourish, and I hope we will see new works on other Asian countries in Africa, even if it is through a comparative perspective with China. Asia is an important partner for Africa. as the continent implements the African Continental Free Trade Agreement with hopes of increasing intra-Africa trade, builds resilience in climate adaptation, and prepares for the inevitable future pandemics. I am pleased that the Asia-Africa Initiative at Harvard has endured under 3 different faculty directors, Arthur Kleinman, Karen Thornberg, and James Robinson for the Asia Center, and Caroline Elkins, Emmanuel Akyeampong, and Ruth Okediji for the Center for African Studies. It is my hope that this initiative will continue to flourish. I'm also happy to see familiar faces from some of our earlier events at this conference. May our deliberation for these 2 days be fun and productive as we learn of each other's work and get to know one another better in the time that we spend together. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you so much for this enlightening remarks that tells a story about big change, right? Tectonic shift in the world, right? In relation to Africa and Asia. And so as we transition to our inaugural session titled Diaspora and Identity in Asia-Africa Relation, it is my pleasure to introduce our distinguished moderator, Duncan Yoon from New York University. And I also want to thank you for helping with the organization of this conference. And I also want to announce your new book, which is very related also to this panel, China in the 20th and 21st Century African Literature, just came out with Cambridge University Press. So let's express our gratitude to Emmanuel again for his remarks and warmly welcome Duncan to take the stage. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming out on this beautiful fall day in Cambridge. I would like to introduce the distinguished writers here for the discussion this afternoon. The first is Ufrieda Ho, who's a journalist from Johannesburg, South Africa. She's the author of Paper Sons and Daughters, and her memoir is on growing up Chinese in South Africa at the time the country undergoes its transition from an apartheid state to democracy. I was also told to add she's a cat lover and an origami folder. The second distinguished writer we have today is Gayatri Sethi, who is an educator, writer, and community builder. She teaches and writes about social justice, global studies, and comparative education. She was born in Tanzania and raised in Botswana. She is of Punjabi descent, multilingual, and polycultural. She reflects on these lifelong experiences of identity, immigration, and belonging in her award-winning nonfiction book titled Unbelonging. She is also the co-founder of the Desi Kidlit community, an initiative to build solidarity among South Asian diaspora writers for young people. When she is not reading or recommending, reads on Instagram as @DesiBookAuntie. Remember that for the social media plug. She is envisioning traveling, collaborating, and gathering in collectives. And it's my pleasure to welcome you both to the stage to begin our conversation. Wonderful. So I thought we could start, since we've invited both of them to talk about their books. I thought it would be a great idea to have them read from their books as a way to kick off the conversation. So I guess we can just go in order here. Gayatri, do you mind going first?
Greetings, everyone. Isn't it a marvel that we're actually here gathered in person? Minor miracles. Who am I? I'm a hyphenated human. I'm adept at adapting wherever I go. I'm a polyglot, malleable. I speak many tongues. I have numerous personas. Survival. I make myself at home but I'm not sure where I belong. Some days, my hyphens and parentheses erase me. For all this, I'm judged. I'm judged harshly for being inauthentic, fake, too much this, not enough that. Do you judge me because you don't understand me? Identity. Who am I? All I know is you don't decide who I am. I do. And then I'll read you a little excerpt of a piece inspired by all around the globe, hate crimes are proliferating and politicians threaten to send us back. And people demand go back where you came from. So I wrote a very long piece, but I'm going to read just a small excerpt of that. Beware if you attempt to send me back. Partition me piece by piece. Too many pieces, traces of me will be left behind in America's soil. How will you erase or recompense me for the cumulative impact of my existence here? As my soul is indivisible, she will roam unshackled and borderless wherever she pleases to be. Send me back, piece by piece, yet I will remain intact.
Hi everyone. So the piece I'm going to read you a little bit, and the context is really about my parents obviously being living a whole different life that I live, and how I increasingly have this distance between my parents because we just live in different worlds. So it might just start as if it's in the middle of nowhere, so just bear with me. So I'll start here. The West had also won over our walls. Johnny Depp and River Phoenix's pictures with brooding eyes and flicked back hair stared out over our beds. The white boys my parents feared. They never made us take down the posters, but they did not like the idea that we hero worshipped pop idols of the blonde, blue-eyed brigade. My parents had also had to contend with the Western phenomenon of a matric dance. I think you guys call it a prom. That symbolic graduation from childhood into the adult world of things formal and proper, like high-heeled shoes and bow ties. The matric dance meant trips to dressmakers, shoe shops, and the Oriental Plaza, the fabric and haberdashery hub in Fordsburg, where they stocked fabrics with names like LeMay that were as glittery as their names sounded. Fortunately for me, Yolanda and Calvin, so that's my brother and sister, had also eased this path for me with their share of sequins, dressmaking, cummerbunds, corsages, and of course dates. Yolanda's poor dates and dance partners were subjected to all the embarrassing jokes and jibes that we as the younger siblings could muster, peering through curtains, howling and giggling into our t-shirts as they rang the doorbell. My parents were supposed to be a little more at ease with this farewell dinner when it was my turn to dance through that schoolyard ritual of that rite of passage. My parents were supposed to, there's a quote. So have you found a partner yet for your matric dance? Mom asked me one afternoon after I got back from school. I wasn't thinking about it too much at that moment, and jokingly I told her I was sorted. I'm taking a boy called Donatello to the matric dance, I chirped. What kind of a name is Donatello? My mother asked. And I joked that he was a hot Italian. My mother did not get the joke, and she started getting tetchy. She did not believe me when I told her later that I came up with the name because it was a character from the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, the 4 green reptiles, which I watched on TV most afternoons after school. I took her tongue lashing and I put it down to something being lost in translation, and I left it at that. But a few nights later, when my dad was home a bit earlier than usual, he called me to him before I went to bed. Mom tells me you're thinking of asking a white boy to your matric dance. The lecture was coming. So I rolled my eyes and tried to tell him my Ninja Turtle defense. He listened, but it did not save me from a lecture. My dad said that white men were not a good choice for Chinese girls, said that they did not understand or have respect for the traditions and our customs. Had only to look at some of the people we knew, he continued. My father angled the story on an old family friend. She had a failed marriage with a Chinese man and had become involved with a white man who started treating her abusively. My father was called in often to intervene, calming things down, or to take her and her children away when this boyfriend acted up and could not be reasoned with. I nodded, silently cursing the turtles and my silly joke. And with my sequins dress and my hair made up, I went to the dance with a Chinese boy whom I did not know, but who thankfully was not much of a reptile.
So much for both of those readings. As a way to kick off our conversation, I just wanted, I guess, start with the beginning. What were some of the reasons for writing the book? Was it an event, an experience, an epiphany? What was kind of the catalyst that brought about the impulse to write?
So mine really started as I'm a journalist, but mine started as an anthropology project, and we were asked to look at kinship structures and to actually do a family tree. And I was at that stage a working journalist already, but wrote the assignment, handed it in to the professor and said to her, you know, it was the toughest thing I ever wrote. And she knew that I worked as a journalist, and she said, you know, but you're right. And I said, no, actually it's because all the ghosts of the people who've come before me were sitting in that room when I wrote this assignment about our family tree. And I think it started this journey of really looking at my story, because I think as journalists we write about other people's stories. And now suddenly it was, this question to myself was really, why did I not actually spend more time looking at it? And then later on, I ended up doing a journalism research project that was really about, and I wanted to look at migrants, because my parents were the migrants at my kitchen, and then compared it to the new Chinese who were arriving. And it was as if 40 years had passed, and it was a short in breath, really, between my parents' experience and the new Chinese who arrived post-apartheid. And then the third one was actually really, the third piece ended up being about the Congolese community in South Africa, and just trying to find the threads from that. And then a book's editor said, you have a book here, and I kind of believed her. Well, I didn't at that point, but and then it happened. That's how it went down.
You know, I have to confess that I was a reluctant writer, and in the process of earning my 3 letters and writing a doctoral dissertation, I internalized that I actually could not write and that I had nothing to say. And so if there's anybody here working on a project, I want to say 20 years from now, you might have an award-winning nonfiction hybrid memoir that gets added to syllabi. You don't know. I didn't know 20 years ago. And actually, primarily I was writing to process a lot of information, a lot of events that were happening. If you're familiar with documentary poetry, they inspired me. A lot of documentary poetry inspired me to take everyday things that were happening, such as, you know, political movements all over the globe, saying send them back. And I would then process that. And I tried to write it in my own voice, and it took a lot of practice to kind of unlearn the academic ways of speaking, that jargon that we internalize, all of the ways that I was teaching in the classroom, courses on global studies. I had to actually undo some of that, and so a lot of this project was about unlearning, undoing, remembering, recuperating, filling in the blanks, processing. And also, you know, at the time when I first started to write these, I was teaching courses and taking undergrad students on study abroad experiences and designing global learning curricula. And I was constantly searching for content that I could add to explain to 19, 18-year-olds some of these concepts like globalization or Africa-Asia relations, and coming up short. And so I started to then use some of the personal writings that start out as journal entries and collate them into what this has turned into.
That's great. I mean, I think that also touches a bit upon another question I was curious about, which was how your other careers that were writing, education, and being a journalist, I guess that's still writing in some capacity. How did those inform your creative endeavors?
So as I said, being an educator, really, the book is created almost based on my pedagogy, right? So I would be the professor that would walk in and ask a question and then hold silence. And so I have blank pages with nothing but questions in this book. I have colleagues who send me notes to say, oh, our ninth graders read your piece on identity and we had a learning activity over it. And so I designed it with that in mind, primarily for pedagogy, primarily for reflection, primarily as, there are books that will teach you things, but there are books that will make you think about things or rethink. And I really came from that instinct to rethink what it means to be African, rethink what it means to be, of Asian descent, growing up in Africa, rethink some of these things that we might have learned because most of us, growing up were subjected to a colonial curriculum, and we still haven't unlearned that and decolonized our mind, so to speak. And so I came from that instinct to rethink and relearn and process. And there's a lot of open-endedness in this piece, this book that I wrote, because it actually invites folks to then do their own thinking. This is where I'm coming from, and sort of invites inquiry. And so that's, my educator life really influenced the way that I approach writing this.
So I think for me as a journalist, I always say journalism is a little bit like, for me, it's like having a backstage pass to every concert. And I love that that access that you get, and it's a little glimpse into people's lives. And I think when you start seeing more people and start seeing how life can be made in many different ways, and that is all valid and all important, and it adds to that texture of life, I think that really helps me find the small stories of what's important, and I like to focus in on that. So I think journalism has helped me greatly, and for all its sins, I still am not in a government job. So,
thank you for that. As this conference is about Asia-Africa studies, and tomorrow it's going to be a very interdisciplinary conversation, and today is more devoted, I think, to literature and the arts. I was struck by how your writing and your own identities and positionalities might highlight certain things about exchanges between Asia and Africa that maybe are under-examined aspects, or maybe conversely challenges stereotypes and generalizations within this larger framework of Asia-Africa relations.
I think for me, being able to focus in on a tiny community, I mean the Chinese in South Africa, before we call it this wave of, the second wave of Chinese, or the third wave, I can't really remember, because I'm a journalist and I can't count. But this wave of, this post-apartheid wave of Chinese is really a tiny, tiny minority. I think at the height there were about 25,000 people. And it's a forgotten story, and maybe a difficult one to confront, because you are dealing with people like my father, this Farfiman, this person of the shadows of illegality as a way of survival that becomes livelihood. And maybe it's a complicated thing to confront. And I would hope that the book really stands as offering that there are many ways to make a life. There are many ways to actually be, and that, like my father's story in this is really a bit of the history and the story of Chinese in South Africa. That is also part of the shadows and part of the stigmas, and I think that is something also to confront. So I'm hoping it's that, but also that as time moves on, that the next generation also find their voice to write about what it means now to actually be identified, not with a China that, where my paternal grandmother basically dies of all the illnesses of poverty, as someone from a village, and my father arrives in South Africa as a stowaway, as a paper son, having to take this borrowed identity, or not identity that someone offers you through a piece of paper. And now we've got China, this rising superpower. Back then, it's a whole different story, and it's a whole different identity. And I think people, I can see people navigating it differently. Whether you with somebody who, the generation like my parents, the shopkeepers, the Farfimen, who actually try to hide under the radar, to be invisible deliberately, and a new kind of now people owning an allegiance and a connectedness to something that is a superpower. They're very different. But I think we should really remember that there are these other complicated histories as well. And they're also part of, and they're filled with people, and they're filled with people's stories. So I'm hoping.
Yes, people and people's stories. Let me echo that and say it out loud, because I think in the conference we may be really exploring meta level, state-to-state relations, economic relations, and so on. And much of the dominant narratives around Africa and Asia really don't operate outside of sort of the mechanics of our colonial histories. And so what I want to say is that throughout time, before colonizer decided to bring folks like me, in indenturehood throughout Africa, people were still relating. Look at Madagascar, look at the peoples of Mauritius and Seychelles, look at the Swahili coast where I grew up. The people of Africa and Asia have always been interacting. A group of Sethi people of Afro descent live, in what's known as India, and are probably some of the most persecuted people, with caste systems really implicating them throughout time. And so, the people have always related. Even our languages have resonance, and there's so many clues that people-to-people stories, show that we've always related throughout time. But have we related in ways that are reciprocal, mutual, respectful? Maybe not. Maybe not. I think that the relating isn't really outside of structures of extraction, as you talk about in your work, Duncan. And so what I wanted to do in this book is to really complicate what that looks like. I talk a great deal about, immigration narratives often, talk about, oh, well, we exist too, brown Africans exist too, and then, and so what? and what's your point? Where are you going with that? And so a lot of times we argue for our existence and validation, but did we go back in time, in space, in kind of heart and mind and soul and ask, did we have consent to enter where we came, right? Did the peoples of where we call ourselves home invite us in, right? So I talk a lot in my book about learning this, in Botswana, we'll approach someone's yard, and from before we even approach their door gate, we'll say, Koko, and then somebody on the inside will say, Tena, and that means we ask for consent to enter their yard. And I invite co-learners often to ask, wherever we're going, wherever we're immigrating, wherever we are, did we ask? Did we say, Koko, Tena, or in Kiswahili we say, Hodi, Karibu, and did we do that? Did we, whose sacred lands are we in right now? Did we say, hey, the sacred keepers of these lands, is it okay for us to enter here? And, to bring those remembrances of our intercultural connections. And then I talk a great deal also about the notion of cultural humility and how important it is for non-Black Africans, such as myself, to practice cultural humility. We exist, my family exists because people said, yes, Tena. We have passports that say we belong in Botswana because someone made it so, and that someone it's not my entitlement. It is not my entitlement, and I will never take that as such. To call myself a person who grew up in Botswana, that means it comes with responsibilities. It comes with, am I going to be a person among people? There are many ways to say that, but Ubuntu is one of them. Have I learned that? Because otherwise it matters not. That it matters nothing. What does it matter? So those are some of the questions about our human relations, our person-to-person relations, relating outside of structures of inequality and extraction that I invite us to consider in this book.
That's really lovely. I love this idea of thinking about people-to-people connections because it really gets at the multifaceted nature of this. It's not just multinational corporations. It's not just bilateral relations between states. It's actually individuals and communities that are relating to each other in new and interesting ways. So I'm going to take my privilege here as a literary critic to insert kind of a big concept into the conversation. There's a great theorist of diaspora, Professor Attukwaising, is at Stanford, and he has this concept of genealogical accounting as being one of the key figures for when we think about diaspora and diasporic formation. So this idea of genealogical accounting is, when a writer writes a text to be able to understand their origins, where they're coming from, why are they there, and also how that origin might actually be multiple, or it might actually, that singular origin might not actually exist. So this kind of writing back through generations to kind of tell your story of where you come from and why you exist where you are. I was wondering how, if you could talk a little bit about how such a concept of genealogical accounting might function in your memoir or in your creative nonfiction.
Should I go? So I think for me, when I saw that question, I immediately thought about how growing up I would greet every Chinese person in a supermarket. Like I remember I said we were a tiny, tiny community because they would know your parents. And then they would ask back, who's your father? It was never about who you are, your personal individual identities. Where did you fit in that map? And when you think of, when you said this thing of sort of like mapping back who came before us, those ghosts that I talked about, I think it's a, I mean, I don't know if I've understood correctly the concept or the framework, but I think it's really important to actually understand where the story begins, but also how it evolves. And I think and the stories that are still to come, I think that's for me, that's what struck when I read that question of yours. So yeah, but I think it's understanding that you really fit into a bigger map, but really without you, there's missing a point, but you're not anything without this map that actually stands as a fuller picture of a community or a family, or yeah. So yeah, that's my take on that.
For many people, such as myself, who've been multiply transplanted, right? So people are not trees, and some of us have this immense experience, which I always wish I could relate to, of being planted in one place and then growing up into this tall, glorious baobab that just stands in glory. But I don't have that experience because genealogically, if I were to try to collect the anecdotes going back to where it begins, my ancestors are from the part of Punjab that's now Pakistan, and none of our living relatives or since then have returned to the place of ancestry. And so the idea of ancestry, the idea of the origins is very remote and theoretical for me. It's not even accessible, right? Because of partition. And the people who were directly impacted by that cannot speak of it, cannot write of it, cannot pass down or share anecdotes. And trust me, I have tried for much of my adult life because for some reason, ancestors made it so I was the one asking the questions, right? So every generation, there's one of the ones that's like, and how? And why? And where are we really from? And what were they? And I was today years old when I realized that some of my ancestors were Sikh. And nobody told me. It wasn't passed down. Those anecdotes were severed from us. And that is why I think that it matters that we do this work of inquiry, of filling in the remembering past the story that was told to us. Because the story that was told to me did not give me access to that. Remind us again, genealogical accounting. It's like you bring that up and it's silence. It's an expanse of openness, a void that is like a soul wound. And how do we heal that? And we heal it by trying to be in relation. So then, then I sit in quietness and I ponder and I think, what do I know without being told? And then I try to put it down in here. And so that's why I try to do that excavation of work. And many of my cousins still don't know some of the things that I have been able to excavate. Maybe they'll read the book, maybe not. But I did it for us, for, as you said, the stories yet to come. So that's what comes to mind for me with that phraseology.
I would love to get into some of the passages and some of the ideas that are in both of these works. So my first question here is for Ufrieda. You know, the title of the memoir is Paper Sons and Daughters, and this gestures to the challenges of mobility under apartheid bureaucracy, and maybe you can speak a little bit about that and why these bits of paper were so determining for your family's history. For example, something that I always come back to when I teach your memoir is that letter that your father had to carry around with him to declare him a gentleman of good standing.
So, just to come back to my father, the paper son. So basically, my father was orphaned he was orphaned growing up in China. Our village is called Daidan, which is in Sundak today, and I think it was a time when it was just about trying to find some kind of different life that might be of something that was not even, I think, promise and prosperity, but just something, a way out of, I think, a quite dire situation in the village where he grew up and as an orphan. And so when he arrived in South Africa, I mean, he was one of the people who knew he was coming to South Africa, because I think a lot of people who were leaving China were really looking for these gold mountains. We call it Gamsan in Cantonese. So Johannesburg, he knew he was coming here because he had a brother in what was Lorenzo Marx today, Maputo. But coming to South Africa under apartheid, you're the yellow peril, you're the unwanted. So to get here, you'd have to basically buy an identity or borrow an identity, and I think this was done throughout the world. So you're basically taking a placeholder and filling in that spot. So the woman that basically gave him her identity, I called her Kema, adopted granny, till she died, because my father treated her like a granny till, but we were not blood relatives. So that's the story. My father obviously arrives here. He's a stowaway because you're not going to come through passport control, and and that basically starts making a life here, and he ends up being a Fafi man. This essentially an illegal gambling game. What was the other part you asked me about? The title and? The piece of paper. So I came across, going through my father's stuff years later, just these pieces of paper that actually become part of your identity. Without them, you're considered, you can't get access to this, or you're not good enough for that. It's about a piece of paper, and in this case, it was a piece of paper that he must have carried every day in his breast pocket, and it has these folds in it. And I always said it felt to me when I found that piece of paper, because it was really a piece of paper about allowing him to be on the train and not being kicked off that class of train based on your race. And when I found it, I said, it felt to me it was like it had all these folds in it, and I always felt it was like a dog collar, that when you take a collar off a dog and it still has that, his fur is still sort of like marked, and that felt to me like that every day it was a kind of like leash that he probably wore. And without that document that you can produce when you asked for it, then you asked to get off the train. And I think so that's what that letter was about.
Yeah, I mean, the figure of the gambler for me was really striking as a way, when you were talking about your father as a Fafi runner, as a Fafi man, and thinking about adopting a gambling mentality or becoming a gambler as part of the diasporic experience, as this figure of risk that is embodied his identity, right? So there's a way in which thinking about diasporic identity as a kind of gamble, as a kind of risk itself. It was just so on point and really powerful, I thought. Gayatri, in your book, there's this motif that reoccurs in various points in different sections, and I think it's a reference to the hit TV show Blackish. I don't know if it is, but you have different sections titled Africanish or Desi-ish or Americanish, and so I'm curious, what does this ish represent for you?
Do we have anyone here who's from Southern Africa? When you hear the sound, it's usually untranslatable. So throughout the book, I have these hidden messages for people who share identities with me. When we say shh, it's you know,
Ish, yeah.
so there's that element of shh, and then there's an element of ish, as in like sort of ish, right? And then there is that identity talk, and I used to, you know, as a global studies professor, we always have to do a unit on identity, right? But those of us who are multi-identified, who are diasporic, who are questioning these identity markers and these boxes you're supposed to check, who are interrogating how white supremacy, you know, informs some of these identifications and conversations around identity. So to me, identity matters, but also throughout the book, the motif is really to invite the reader to say shh to identity talk, because it's a lot of shh. Yeah, I'm not going to defile the space by saying an expletive, but it really is, right? Because eventually, when identity talk happens, a lot of shh happens. And so those are some of the reasons why I was playing with words and language, right? Because again, I am really trying to express myself outside of translation, and to use a book like this to like even challenge language and to reinvent language. So I even have a verse in there that's ish, right? So I'm ish anything. You tell me a marker and I'm an ish of that, right? I sort of ish, right? You say, oh, they see Bukanti. Yes, they see ish, right? Because I grew up in Africa, so maybe, you know, really I don't claim authenticity. And so, you know, conversations around authenticity, identity tend to be really murky and really, so I was trying to kind of come back to that. And yes, some people have said, oh, you know, did you get it from Blackish? Well, sort of, but because it's an inside joke in my racial family, you know, my children are ish, they're Blackish, right? They're Black with, you know, a brown African, you know, mom, so they're Blackish. So that conversation is an ongoing conversation, you know, with people I share identities with. Yeah, yeah.
This when you brought up language, you know, it also made me think in my literary critic mind, oh, I want to talk about language and how it features in each of your work, particularly this aspect of multilingualism, of being not just in between cultures or identity, but also in between languages. And Gayatri, your poem, Speaking in Tongues, I was thinking of when I wrote this question. And Ufrieda, yeah, the depiction and representation of your mother's use of the pidgin fanagelo, or fanagelo?
Fanagalo.
Fanagalo, yeah. So maybe if, Ufrieda, maybe you can start.
Yeah, so fanagalo is, it's a made-up language. It really came from the mines in South Africa, and it was about, it was basically a way to actually speak to people who came from different backgrounds, and it was, but it was a language of commands and instruction, but most people ended up being able to pick it up because it borrowed from so many different languages. So my mother, in my family, my father goes out, he's the Fafi man, my mother stays home, she's raising the children, and she obviously has, like her English doesn't, like my mother's never read my book because she doesn't speak English, and which is really tragic, but she picks up Fanagalo, she can pick it up because she worked as a shopkeeper at some time, she looked after somebody's shop, and the language I think is, and in the book I write about this one bit where obviously now it's really problematic and it's quite offensive because it's this bastardized language, it's a language of instruction and command. It had the boss and the workers, it was that kind of language. And she sometimes responds to people in Fanagalo, and I'm like, die of embarrassment, like you cannot say that anymore, like oh, and then you'll see people will like laugh a little because they understand exactly what she's saying, because we all understand the language, we all, you understand bits of it, and so when she responds to them, they just forgive her, number one, I think, because you understand it actually, this is a strange way of connecting, even though the language has now become so problematic in the way we see it today. It is a language that is actually quite, people understand it. We understand what we're saying, and I think that's the one sad thing about South Africans, is that we still don't really speak each other's languages fluently enough to actually connect properly, and that's problematic. And then you have something like this weird language like Fanagalo that is now, I mean, we don't use it anymore because obviously it's pretty offensive, but everybody understands it. So there's that strange dynamic there as well. But yeah.
Is it okay if I read it?
Sure, yeah.
Maybe you can see it visually. Like I messed with the pages a lot too. So even the page, like speaking in tongues, has like a little bit of like lines drawn. And the questions that preceded the speaking in tongues were, who taught me to own myself? And who taught me to name myself? And then I left a blank. So, so whoever's reading it can reflect themselves if they choose to. And so speaking in tongues, now it's a reference, Chandra Mohanty talks about this, and I think Gloria Anzaldúa also does. So if you're kind of, a scholar of third world feminists, or, you can look up the citations. And I also did citations very differently. So if I had, a verse or a reflection entitled Speaking in Tongues, I gave you a citation without a footnote. Right. And so I learned to speak in many tongues. Kiswahili, English, Punjabi, French. I would even speak Hindi and write in Sanskrit alphabet, and as an adult, I no longer recall how. I hear Gujarati, Spanish, Setswana, and Farsi too. And those who taught me words, names, concepts, ideas, and gave me a pencil so I may ideate, taught me to know myself. Even as they did, they graded my assignments and wondered why I would not obey. I was a gifted student, punished for talking too much. The teachers who taught me words but silenced my many thoughts were many. The forces to silence brown children under the guise of making them polite and respectful were strong. These forces both shaped me and denied me. I learned as an adult to reclaim my voice and my words. What I write and how I write are forms of self-claiming. I speak in tongues. I stitch the fractured and erased parts of myself back together into healing cohesion. I speak myself in multiple tongues. I'm just reading it for you to answer your question.
I love it.
Very much that we as human beings, we can invent language. And in the process of inventing language, we can also invent connection, invent identity, invent self, and most of all, invent ways, as you were saying, it just sort of struck a chord with me, that we still don't speak each other's languages. Mm-hmm. And so that's one of the inclinations I had throughout the places that I visited. When I first came to the US, I realized I needed to speak Spanish. It was just a thing, when I ask my children what they need to speak, I say Mandarin and Spanish, right, because of where they're growing up. But, I have not been successful in imparting any of these languages to my children, as much as I have attempted to do so. So their world is not my world, and I don't want to impose that on them. But at the same time, I really want to thank, my mother in particular, who insisted on imparting languages of ancestry. Because without that, again, I'd be even more unmoored than I already am. There would be less remembering happening. And I think so speaking in tongues and speaking many languages isn't just a function of where you grew up in an accident of birth. It's really a deep intention, because the intention is wherever you go, wherever you be, wherever you go, that you be able to relate to the people there, and what are their languages and what are their words. And the language of academia was one I had to learn. I didn't include that here, but that's a whole other language, right? The language of academia.
Yeah.
What did you say had to be included in that? Trope and.
I said it's just not acceptable. It's not going to, if it does not say liminal or trope. And I say this as a journalist who looks at those words and just think, like, come on, give us an easier way to understand this.
Well, we're coming up on time, and I had a closing question I wanted to ask both of you. And it's funny because you said that this is a question you like to ask writers, but you don't like to ask yourself. But are there some favorite writers out there that either greatly influenced your writing or something that you just has stuck with you as you think about your own creative process or comes out as you put pen to paper?
As I said, really deeply unfair question. And I used to, when I write profiles, I sometimes ask people to say three authors or three books that were really influential for you in your life. And after said, gee, that is a terrible question to ask anyone. And then this got thrown back at me. But I think for me, when I was writing this, I was thinking about, I happened to come across, and it was actually a piece that Paul Salopek wrote in Nat Geo, and it was really about his connection with his father, and he sets a scene of sort of like he's in the car with his dad, and he starts talking about just the memory of this childhood memory of being with his father, and it really struck me because I think I start my book really with waiting for my father outside a bank, as all children do, waiting to kill time because adults have adult things to do. And I'm literally counting the perforations in our family's old cortina and then getting lost at 43 and starting again. And he talks about this just listening to his father, and he goes into sort of like about the people who've come before, his ancestors and stuff like that. And I thought that piece was really beautiful. And knowing what he's doing now around sort of the Out of Eden walk, I think really just brings us back to these origin stories all the time. So I find that really beautiful. Lately, I've been just totally in love with the Diaspora, Michael Ondaatje's book. As I said to you earlier, like you read something like that and you go, why do I write when they're masters? Like, you know, enough. And yeah, and then I think a lot of it is just, I love the writers Ben Okri, you know, who just takes you on that magic realism and really sort of roots it again in the continent that is my home. Song lines as well. I think of Bruce Chatwin's work and stuff like that. Just so many, and I think they all come back to origin stories and ways to tell stories that maybe are unexpected, but people who just breathe some kind of life into maybe those words and into the stories, that I find beautiful and just compelling. So.
Yes, too many to name. And, you know, lately I think I would just say that I read a lot of poetry, and documentary poetry in particular, you know, where, you know, in this moment today, you know, we are living in a world where there are some really severe things happening, some things that we need to process and figure out how to make sense of, ideally in community and in collectives that we would make sense of that. And so I really gravitate to poetry because there's ways in which we invent language and invent kind of ways of viewing things. So this week in particular, I'm reading a lot of Palestinian poets. Muhammad El-Kurd in particular, Noor K. Hindi. In my students, my co-learners say that I never miss an opportunity to bring up bell hooks. So if there was actually only one, it is a character flaw of mine that I never miss an opportunity to say, read bell hooks, and bell hooks taught me as a hashtag. And so generally when I am in a place of lacking language or lacking understanding on a concept, it is more than likely that I will go to one of the many books bell hooks blessed this world with to find some answers. So that's not unusual for me on any given day or week to try to find sense making in bell hooks's work.
I think we're just about out of time, but I think we wanted to ask if there was any questions someone might have from the audience, anything that struck you, any kind of, I don't know, something that's been on your mind as we've been discussing. We were hoping to open it up a little bit to the audience.
Thank you very much for that. I was listening to you talking about I talk to you as Africans. It seems to me that concept of belonging, human history, you know, social ordinary history seems to be going up about things and changing itself. But because of histories of globality, what is the violence in India? All life is talked about intellectuals in terms of trauma. But what I want to ask is, do you, you as women who grew up in Africa and mostly rural, just ordinary life, do you feel richer? You know, you speak a lot of language, you came out of a situation and came to America and learned. Do you feel fuller? Do you feel richer people than, for example, your mom, as Chinese woman in a situation? Just how do you feel about it? Do you feel you don't need to belong to anywhere else? You don't have to apologize because you're richer, you're fuller, and also another question is, like you were talking about, Morrison, I think, saying that people should not appropriate the trauma of slavery, African American, and use it, disrespect. But on the other hand, there is a concept of affective solidarities, attachment, as a way of new agency of joining new communities through felt activities, practices, what, food, love, music. How do you feel positively about human existence, forged through these traumas and everything else? Sorry, there's no way out. Do you know what I'm getting at? What is the future of becoming very different and then reached by these rather than traumatized forever?
For me, and I think it was a little of, I think, what you talked about also, like, does otherness actually have a positive side? And I think you're right. I think as I go through life, I think I think when you're able to claim all these things, including the traumas, the triumphs, including the difficult things you perhaps find difficult to confront, but at the same time living in different worlds, like I was saying to Duncan, this Harvard is the furthest you could actually pull that distance between my father, the Fafi man, this working person who actually survives by this gambling game, to this. But there is a connectedness, and there has to be, because I think that's how you open up to actually explore all those ways that you can be, all the ways that you can claim as individuals, but also understanding that we're communities, as you said. And so for me, that I think if I understand what you're saying, it's really about how, as you change and you're exposed to different influences, how that molds you as a different person now, compared to, say, my mother or my grandmother. My grandmother was actually, she was separated from my grandfather for 18 years because he arrived in South Africa first. And it took 18 years before she was able to join him. And by that time, they were strangers. My mother was a grown woman, ready to be married. And I think there is a different world that's opened up to us. And I think, but it's not to ignore the hurts, the traumas, the things that still need questioning. But I think there is a beautiful invitation to say, actually, maybe go there and actually, for each one of us, I think, and find what it is that needs telling, maybe, needs writing. So I don't know if that answered, but that's kind of, yeah.
And I think in your question, there was just such a deep invitation for us all to consider the importance of solidarity. And, as much as I was saying in my earlier remarks that questions of identity are limited, how it can matter is if we use those identifications to find shared humanity in each other. And I think really I'm just so deeply, profoundly at a loss for words how to convey how grateful I am that I grew up in Africa, because that is where I learned through the practices of people and how people are with each other to be a person among people. And it's really something that's practiced. It's just, a welcoming in, a togetherness, even when we haven't earned it. And this is where I feel a great deal of guilt as a brown, I often there's a book, The Karma of Brown Folk, that a lot of South Asians cite. And, I ask in this book the question, what is the karma of brown folk under settler colonialism? And it's not a good one. And I think that solidarity is possible through the grace and forgiveness and reckoning and truth-telling that is necessary, and those are all ways to heal. So really in my work, there's less trauma recycling and much more sort of like, and then what do we do with it? What do we transmute it into solidarity? So I start with talking about identity, and the book ends with talking about solidarity. So that's the journey I take you all on to go, well, and then, having unbelonging as a concept that really shifts us not to be so stuck in the categories of our identities that we cannot build with each other, with humans that don't share that. And so it's all about kind of, can we unbelong just enough so that we see our shared humanity? And that's kind of the invitation I have.
I think we are, well, how are we doing on time, Tenzin? Oh, okay. Okay. I completely got the thing. Okay.
Oh, okay, that's accurate.
Okay.
Oh, we have plenty of time.
So yeah, we can. Okay, this is great. I thought
We can converse.
Hi. I'm curious about both of you in your respective contexts, whether you've had like these kind of public fora about your books in South Africa, in Botswana, in Tanzania, in East Africa, and how, like, what the reception of the books has been. Because I think, like you said, being in Harvard is a completely like distance geography from like what the kind of tensions and contradictions and unbelonging and belonging that you're talking about. And I'm curious because, so I was born in Kenya and then I lived 7 years in South Africa. And so being in community with people there still, we still have, I often find that in my communities, we have a block that is not entirely like anybody's particular fault, but it makes it very difficult to move past that block. Much of it is anti-Blackness in Asian communities in both geographies, but it's also just the blindsidedness of having been caught in Southern, Western discourses for so long, and part of our schoolwork and our education and everything, it's just like blocks us from having like the conversations in the other directions. So I'm wondering what tensions you've encountered in different geographies with different audiences, with what contradictions, what solidarities, what, happy and not so happy moments that you've had when you present this book in public, not here in the States.
Thank you for that. I don't know if I'll do justice to that inquiry because it's deep and profound, right? So when we are talking about people-to-people connections, when we're talking about reckoning and truth-telling and reconciliation, there's a lot of that work still yet to be done. Apartheid as a regime may be gone, but apartheid structures of relating to one another have not been healed, because that kind of healing doesn't just happen when you have a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, because we are still very separated from one another. We are still dealing with the wounds of, the racial hierarchy that was imposed upon us, not, and again, I say, coming back to what is the brown folk, like the thing is that my people have earned their bad reputation on the African continent. We really have, because we haven't done right by the folks that we're in community with and whose lands we have come to for whatever reason that brought us there, whether we came in 1970 or whether we were brought there, by the British. We were brought there as masters' tools, and we haven't really unlearned what that means to this day. So I wrote this book, and there's this big segment in the book that is an entire community call-in. I use that on purpose because it's an invitation for us to really grapple with that reality and say, hey, as brown folks of Asian descent on the African continent, what is our karma? What have we really done? And it's not always right. You know, it's not always right. In fact, we've done a lot of wrong that we need to really recompense for. And that conversation does not go well. So to ask your question, my people don't want to have that conversation. So it's kind of a sore point for me, because whether it's a conversation about Islamophobia within the South Asian diaspora, or whether it's a conversation about the fact that racial categories are not consistent globally, but what is globally consistent is anti-Blackness. And so when I say that out loud, it doesn't matter who's in the room, the energy drops like it did right now. But I'm kind of unapologetic. I'm like, what, you're gonna fire me for saying that? I'm a guest. I have the mic. I said we have work to do, and the conversations do not go well. And I am so distraught that even younger generations don't want to have that conversation, because I wrote it so that perhaps you could say, hey, a gray-hairing old auntie is saying we are anti-Black, let's fix ourselves, might work, but nobody's trying to hear me. But let me be, an old white man professor, maybe they would hear me. We're still living in a world in which who we listen to and what we listen to is very circumscribed. So we aren't really having those conversations, but we need to. Did I answer your question? Okay.
I think from my side, I have to say that the presence of China in Africa is obviously, there's a lot, it's problematic, because I think people see it as the arrival of the new colonizer. I think that kind of framing is still there. And in recent years, I think it's when the Chinese sort of like companies arrived, it was with a lot of bringing in their own labor. For example, people stayed in their own enclaves, so it became very difficult. And then there was the language barriers, and I think that still persists on some level. And I think it would be foolish to not to think that it's like they all arrived and everybody's just happy and we live together happily. I think it's exactly as you said. It's there is a it's not even problematic. Doesn't even begin to cover that issue. I think it continues. I think we had BRICS, recently in South Africa, which was a real statement. So politically, also we've seen, but then we also see China in South Africa cozy up to the political parties. And that's been a very deliberate strategy, especially under Jacob Zuma, the previous president. And so that shifted a little, and it's gone quite quiet. And another thing that really affected it, for example, was COVID, strangely. And then COVID also gave rise to this backlash against the Chinese. So there are all these dynamics that are constantly at play when you ask about sort of that it's not a comfortable connection. But I can say sort of like what, from my father's generation, when the Chinese were such a tiny minority, and you're invisible, and you're deliberately invisible, and you kept to yourself as a community because the Chinese had more privilege. We had almost like a hierarchy. So it was whites and everybody else. But within that, the people came, it was Indians, and we use these terms in South Africa, so please excuse me, it's Indians, and then so-called colored people, and blacks right at the bottom. Chinese were classified colored till 1994 when we became a democracy. So I think that that weird sort of hierarchy and that structure and those rungs of how we separate people out by race, I think are really still there at play in South Africa. And I think, but for people of that generation, it was quite funny when I started. So this book, as I said, came off a journalism and an anthro project. And I went into the communities to speak to people, and it was, I think, for them, the farfie man, this gambling person who comes into these segregated spaces for black people, the townships, the locations. And the one incident that or the one sort of anecdote that I think I included in this book, which for me just summed it up, this changing, this thing of when you say, it's how do you connect as human beings? And so I go out with this Fafi man who's younger than my father, because that whole generation, my father's generation, didn't even want to speak about Fafi. They were so polite to me to begin with. Sure, because you're Akye's daughter, you can come out with me, when I was trying to do research. When it came to the crunch, they all sort of like fobbed me off. So I ended up going out with somebody who was younger, because he had a whole different, I think your questions about agency and changing sort of, he could speak about it. He could take people to court, because he said, you know, it's like, I'll challenge it in court if you put me in jail for being a Fafi man. But the incident, getting back to that, we end up in this a new development, low-cost housing development, it's black communities. And the Fafi man I'm out there with, he starts off, he's quite like brusque with his the gamblers, but there's this transaction, and it always takes place on this, I always say, away from polite white. It's like it's this mutual dance between people of color, but it's on the wrong side of white, but they are also not friends. They don't, you know, it's two groups on the wrong side of white, but they're not friends, the Chinese and the black communities. But here's this beautiful incident, beautiful little thing. So he's being like, he's fighting with people. He's got quite a stern voice. And the next thing he says to the Arana says to the woman, he says, "Did you like those flowers?" And I go, "What flowers?" And what I realized after it was a new development. And he said what he did was he'd actually taken flowers from, and he said, he said, "Do you like those flowers? Because if you don't like the pink ones, I can get the white ones from my wife." And what it was he was actually taking plants from his house so that she could plant it in her new home, because it's this new development. And in that exchange, I thought it was this interesting connection that we really can have as human beings, even though it's problematic. We're still a divided society. We're divided on race, on income, on all these things that separate us still. And then the other bit that I think I should include was the reaction to the book from the Chinese community, the Chinese South Africans, I think is significant, because this is a story of the invisible, and I think people would have preferred if I wrote a story if my father was not a Fafi man, or was not an imperfect character, right? So I think that, so being able to write a story about, to bring the story that is about Fafi, this ways people survive, especially when you're never going to enter the mainstream middle class or professional life. I was just saying earlier, when this book, one of the book launches, someone actually wrote this letter to me, and when she handed it over to me, she gave it to me and she said, "From one Fafi man's daughter to another." And I think it was finally that thing of being able to claim these stories, you know, even if they are not the ones of my father, the whatever, the businessman, the professor, whatever. It's my father. It's just my father. And I think, so I don't know if I've answered your question either, but I think the reaction to the book has been great, but I understand you're asking a broader question, I think, about how far we've moved in terms of getting along better as human beings, because we are different, we come from different backgrounds, and because we are different race groups. And I think that's super valid, because as Gayatri said, we haven't really interrogated that properly and done the work.
Oh, Ufrieda. She's probably a little scared to have me on the mic. My name is Matt, and Ufrieda and I go all the way back to the early 1990s, working on a newspaper together. Ufrieda stuck with it, and I became a nurse, so you can give you an idea of the state of journalism. First of all, just a little bit of a statement, and then maybe one question at the end. So I've known Ufrieda since the early 90s. She's definitely, right from the start, sort of demonstrated who she is. She's a humanist. She cares deeply about society, people, and what have you. And I think that's a common thread as far as what she's written about throughout her career. I also just wanted to say that having read the book, I've known Ufrieda for a very long time. Excuse me if I get a little bit verklempt, but just learning so much more about you. Ufrieda was also just my true north. She kept me out of a lot of trouble, but not enough. But just learning a lot about you and your family, things that even though we were sitting in cars going, on stories, hanging out and stuff like that, things that I just never knew about you. So I think books like this are important to create a connection between people. I've got a lot of other sort of questions and what have you, but I guess one of the things, your dad is obviously the central figure in this book, and obviously, things around your dad have been difficult. So I guess just sort of, what would you say to your dad right now about where you've been and what you learned from him?
For goodness sake, shouldn't there be beers around when we have this kind of conversation? Thank you. But I really don't know. I think we think about the people who are not here, the people who came before us, and then we live into these lives, and I don't know. I don't know. It's very difficult to say. It's like I think the thing is to live your life and to find the authenticity in it. I think is honor enough for the people who've come before us. I don't think it's these things, these markers of success or whatever, of ticking off boxes. I think it's actually living a more authentic life, I think, is the thing we honor them with most.
I'm from California, which has the largest Asian population in the United States, and we have so many different mixtures of people. We have half black, half Chinese, half black, half Japanese, half black, half, no, I don't want to be on. I don't want my picture taken, thank you. Half black, half Filipino, half black Indonesian. It just could go on and on and on. So at one point there was even like a chance to have a art exhibition with these various people of cross-cultural, heritage, and how they saw themselves and how they, interpreted visually, their heritage. I've also had the chance to travel to Africa, and I've spent most of my time in East Africa, although I have had a chance to make it into Central and Southern. I am really very much interested in seeing and understanding more about the history of Indian people, because I see, for example, with the food, it's really very similar to Ethiopian food. And then knowing some of the history of India, about the Maharajas, who are black people, the Gujaratis, who are black people, and having obviously African ancestry, and knowing about Hannibal, the great general who marched up as far as Russia. So, and then I got kind of hooked on Bollywood, and I see like there's like a dance that we do as African Americans, and I see these like these dances that it's like a line dance, and I kind of saw some like Michael Jackson type of moves with Bollywood. So what I am wondering is, growing up, of course, I learned about Gandhi and some of the other Nehru, and there was this solidarity, there was this between, and I think it's coming back again with the BRIC, with third world countries coming together, and working to show that they are players on the world stage with the former European colonies. So anyway, what I am waiting for is to see Indians, who are now the largest population in the world, come out and to admit about some of their African ancestry and African heritage and relations with Africa. And I am wondering how you could see that happening. Now we're in a digital world. And that's basically it.
Thank you for that beautiful story and question. There are many questions that keep me up at night and steal sleep from me, and that's one of them. Right? Because I have relatives who still live on the Indian subcontinent, and my children are African American. And there is a vast gap even in my own family. And for a long time, one of the reasons I did not impart my South Asian languages to my children is because I really didn't want them to hear the anti-Blackness that was going to be said around them. And I'll be really honest about that. In 1999, when I, was married, it had been the first marriage, interracial marriage with a Black person by an Indian person in the community. And, we said already, we already know who you are. When you go to the shop, they know whose child I am. And it's still like that, even in Gaborone, the capital city of Botswana. And it had not happened until it happened with my wedding, and it has not happened since. And so many of the same aunties who boycotted that wedding with all of the reasons that they have of racial separation, this is what I'm saying is my people have not done right. If you're going to come and live and be Africans and hold that passport, then let's be that way. Let's be with the people. But it hasn't translated into those intimate spaces of person-to-person connections necessarily. My family has really struggled with that because unbelonging is our day-to-day. It's our day-to-day to go into South Asian spaces and to not be embraced. And it's our day-to-day to go to South Asia and have a lot of challenges, because I did bring my family recently before COVID. And it was difficult. So I really don't know what the pathway is, except that in my day-to-day existence, I've committed to building relationships across race and to live that life, right? To not just be theory, because I really hope after this conference, we don't just write nice papers. I hope we do that. But I also hope that we shift ourselves somehow in how we're relating to each other. That is my hope, and why I came, is to say that for me, this isn't a theoretical question. It's one that I constantly, it's messy. It's really messy. And we have to be, humble. We have to be willing to learn. We have to be willing to unlearn the prejudices that have been imparted to us by virtue of how we grew up in this complicated caste system that's global, right? I don't know the answer except to try and try and try and try until there's no more breath left. So that's what I do. I keep trying. If I write a book, if I teach a course, if I go home and talk to my children about how they navigate the anti-Blackness hurled at them, it's a trying. It's messy, but we keep trying.
Can I add a little to this? It's actually it's an article that I actually wrote. So I ended up covering this. It was a beauty pageant, and it was the first time China was going to hold this like a Miss China in Africa kind of thing that they put out a few years ago. And I can send you the link, but it was actually, I wrote it for the Mail and Guardian. So I followed the women who basically were part of this, like really, I mean, I said, oh, what a beauty pageant, and I can't remember what year it was now, but I said a beauty pageant now, and like whatever it was, 2016 or 15 or whatever. And I followed them as part of the story I was going to write, and these contestants came, and they first said there were like about a handful, like seven contestants in the end. And because there were just not enough young women who, of that age group, who were going to be part of this Miss China in South Africa or whatever they called it, I can't remember even. So anyway, they started doing these dances, and I went with them to watch them practice doing these dances, and I sat next to one of the contestants, her mother. And she was obviously someone who had, and I'm using the term in the South African context, colored, Chinese, and Irish. Her name was, I don't know, well, the article I've written about her name, but anyway, so the article, this woman's surname is Murphy, so she had Irish ancestry as well. And I sat next to her mom, and I said, do you know, I really worry for her because she's not going to have a chance in hell, because the judges from who are in China are going to look at this and go, no, this is not Chinese enough, because you're looking for this purity of Chineseness. But we're in Africa, so people are marrying each other, as you said, because we've been here for generations. And we sat there, and I said to her, this is not going to end well, and we're watching this dance and whatever. And then on the night of the crowning, I went along to this, followed it as part of the story, and it was terrible. They flew in these presenters from China who had like some big show in China, and they start asking all the South African Chinese women to say their Chinese names, and they can't say it, or they say it with a terrible accent, because you've lived here for generations and you don't speak Chinese that much anymore, or you speak it with a weird accent. And then the presenter at one point, and I still thought it was like crazy, like how's this man dressed in a tux asking someone in a bikini these questions? Like, this is just like all wrong. And so we go through this whole thing, and like beautiful, smart people, not like basically dismissed because they can't say their name properly with a correct accent, right? And so along comes this candidate, and I mean, I could say her name because I can say her name because it's actually this article that did. And she comes, and the guy just says, he literally went like this, like next candidate, because she clearly doesn't look very Chinese. He went like this. He literally was so dismissive. And I thought, oh golly, this thing is so terrible. Like how I actually predicted this was going to turn out, it's going to turn out like that. And then she won. And so she was crowned this Miss China in South Africa. And I thought, isn't this amazing? Because it shows this understanding that things will change. You are going to fall in love with somebody else. You're going to make beautiful children with somebody else who might not share your skin color. And suddenly, so that piece was for me, and that how it all played out was quite beautiful. And that I also had that I thought that it turned out differently to how I expected, even more beautiful. So if I could just to share that anecdote or that story, that's a true thing. Yo, but enough with the beauty contests. No, so South Africa, so under apartheid, I think the Chinese community was way too small to have townships like we have now in South Africa. There was one, and it's called Kabiga Park in what is now Gqeberha, which was Port Elizabeth then. And it was really, I think, just because the size of the community was so tiny. Literally, like I said, you walk into a shop, you know they're going to know you, because it was such a tiny minority before China opened up, obviously, and before the end of apartheid, because under apartheid, the Nationalist Party had this strange thing of actually trading with Taiwan, which was also seen as a pariah. So like in the 70s and 80s, every single thing you picked up, it said made in Taiwan, because it was a trading partner with the nationalists. And then in 1998, so we become a democracy in 1994. 1998 is when South Africa actually officially makes the diplomatic ties with China concrete. And then obviously the relationship with Taiwan has to be severed. And then this new sort of like wave of people start coming. And then also we have an exodus of Taiwanese communities who were here in the 70s and 80s. They start leaving. And we get the new waves of people coming into South Africa. So that's, if that answers.
Did you ever have relationships with Hong Kong?
Hong Kong, not in a diplomatic sort of like ties, but I think a lot of people, because Hong Kong is Cantonese speaking, so I speak Cantonese. So I think, and my mother a lot of people who ended up leaving the south of China, some of them went to Hong Kong. Like my granny was a seamstress, and she raised my mother there till my grandfather actually, I guess, raised enough money to actually bring them over to South Africa. So I think and then the Hong Kong issue is also quite interesting, because Cantonese is really not, I've heard people call it like the dog's language, and people have to like fight for our Cantonese-ness because we should all be speaking Mandarin, and it's, and there's always that tension as well. And obviously what's happened with the pro-democracy movements and stuff like that in Hong Kong. I think all these things, I mean, I know family members who are divided. They don't talk about it. I know family members who, when the national anthem plays before the 6 o'clock news, he leaves the room. And he lives in Hong Kong. And it's things like that. I think it remains a divide. And I understand that. But yeah, and also complicated, because when I visited Hong Kong recently, not recently, in the last few years, I could see a distinct shift from people who used to speak Cantonese and English are now speaking Mandarin and Cantonese, and even less Cantonese, because you know that thing I talked about allegiances, about reshaping your identity based on where you think it's actually going to give you most privilege, advantage. I think it's part of human nature as well. Maybe we go towards what's going to benefit us best, sadly, instead of finding better connections. Beers.
Hi, such a joy to listen to the both of you. And I'm reminded of this conversation I had with a group of Desi artists in South Africa. They call themselves the Kuti Collective, which is reclaiming the Hindi word, which we will not say in this room. But it was interesting because members of the Kuti Collective were LGBTQ plus members of their society, but they were not all Indian, right? They were all different parts of South Asia. Some of their ancestors were passenger, some of them were indentured labor. So the reasons that brought their ancestors to Africa were so different. They came from different parts of South Asia. And what sort of brought them together was this Desi-ness, or being Desi-ish, right? But what was really interesting was in my conversations with them, a lot of the conversation was about tensions that existed within the Desi communities, right? So you talked about the us brown folk. I didn't really get that sense of us brown folk, because a part of our conversation was about how them as brown Africans were trying to make a space in an art scene, which according to them was divided between the white South Africans and the black South Africans, and they were trying to carve out a space for themselves. But a large part of it was also the tensions that existed amongst themselves, right? The Gujaratis would never marry the Tamils, who would never marry the Kannadigas, who would never marry someone else. And you also spoke about this a little bit, about the new Chinese versus the old Chinese. So I was wondering, could you both talk a little bit about the tensions that exist within these communities? Yeah.
Thank you for pointing that out. And also I realized that, in the last couple of responses, I seem to be hopeless, but really not. Look, we exist, we're here, we're having these conversations. So please don't think that Africa-Asia relations are doomed, based on anything I've said. What I am trying to say is not sugarcoat how much work there is still yet to be done. And I'm not trying to sugarcoat that these tensions and divisions have still to be healed from and moved from, that the invitation is to build solidarity, but we can't arrive at that without dealing with the past and the now, which is still, very, fractured, for lack of a better way of putting it. So let me also say that, yes, so intra-community, and I use the term Desi, and this is a term that people of South Asian descent use to refer to ourselves, right? But we are of many castes, and we are of many languages, so many, hundreds. We are of so many faiths, and one of the current tensions in the world right now is that the state of India is fascist, and there are real genocidal implications of its international relations as well as its relations within. So Arundhati Roy, whose work we might all be familiar with, was arrested this week for being a journalist who spoke against the oppressions that are happening against folks of all castes, but mostly the Muslim folks and the journalists in particular. So that, I don't look to the states to help us build solidarity. I don't look to state level politics or politicians to help us. And so I think one of the works to be done is that any intra-community healing we do within the South Asian diaspora will translate in how we can build across, but we can't even get it together for ourselves, right? Because we have deep levels of casteism within us, and we carry those casteisms with us wherever we go. One of the questions Duncan had raised for us is about being multiply diasporaed, right? So for me, I cannot escape the fact that growing up within the South Asian diaspora in Southern Africa, that those caste systems were brought with. And it doesn't matter if it was hundreds of years ago, we haven't fixed those. We brought them with us and replicated them, right? And what they look like in practice now is anti-Blackness, right? But until and unless we're willing to do these and to say, look how we brought those caste systems, and the fact that, us Punjabis and us Tamils can't even talk to each other, not just linguistically, but across caste or faith, right? So I'm a person of multiple faiths, and that was one of the reasons my father left India, right? Is that he didn't worship in the Hindu way, in the dominant culture required way, and it became nearly impossible for him to exist. So he was like a self-refugee, if you know what I mean. Some people leave because we're like, whoa, I'm not going to last long here in my belief system. I'm going to be persecuted. And so that's one of the reasons he sought refuge in, a rural part of Tanzania to be a school teacher. It wasn't for mercantile reasons. It wasn't, what have you. It was a whole complicated layer of things. So within the South Asian diaspora, wherever we go, we're replicating those. So then, what does that mean? Unless and until we're willing to heal those intra-community divisions, is it possible for us to then build relations across, continents? Question mark, right? There's more work to do, and it's not a one comes before the other. It's a and so a lot of times in my book I'm saying, yes, we have nuances to build on. Yes, we have intra-community work to do, and yes, and we've got to build across, differences as well, across races, across castes, across faiths, and that work is ongoing and is happening. There's so many of us doing that work. That's just my reflection on your question. I hope I answered some part of it.
I think from my side, you're right. There are these tensions, and I think for the Chinese South African community that started off as this, because it was so small, everything was like a hard-won extra privilege or an extra sort of like concession on that rung of the hierarchy of that, how race was, how people were classified in South Africa. And then suddenly when this new wave of Chinese arrive, and by bigger numbers, much bigger numbers, who don't speak Cantonese, who are mostly Mandarin speakers, who come not from Hong Kong or from the South, I think there was, and there continues to be some kind of tension. So for example, like in Johannesburg, we have, for Chinese New Year, we have three festivals, one Chinese New Year, because they can't get it together too. So there's almost like a contest for who's going to, and it's always for whatever reason, it's the first Chinatown that actually, so the people from my parents' generation, that small group of Chinese South Africans who host the first one, then the following weekend they'll do another one in a second Chinatown. And I always say Joburg has this odd distinction that we are the only city that has two Chinatowns. So and then one at the temple. But I think there are those issues. There are those tensions, because I think for a lot of the Chinese South Africans, it was like we fought for these extra little concessions to actually have some kind of that good standing, like of the the thing that my father had to carry. They fought for that. They felt they fought for that. And remember, this is a group of people who were disenfranchised like all other non-whites till 1994. So every little bit that you managed to actually fight for, I think, was so significant to preserve. And suddenly here came a whole new group of people, I think, and I'm generalizing here, a whole new group of people who came with different kind of like money, entrepreneurial skills, all of that. And meanwhile, people like my father's generation or the shopkeepers or whatever, they just slogged every day, and suddenly people were able to do import-export businesses and show a whole lot of different kind of like wealth and all of that kind of stuff. So I think the tensions exist. However, I think things are also changing, as I said in that Hong Kong example of people now trying to maybe find their Chineseness and a closeness to their identity with China. I think that definitely has changed. So how that shapes up, I don't know. But the tensions are definitely there. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. Just briefly. Oh, my name is Farouk Martins. The caste system, division. Okay, thanks. The caste system, the division, whether between Indians, Chinese, or Africans, is it as intense when you are outside home as it is inside home?
And again, I'm going to speak experientially, that whether it's been in Africa or here in the US, the caste system seems pretty rigid, and it travels with people, and there's a level of caste hierarchy that is invisible to most people. So the same people who enjoy caste privilege in the places they come from come to the US and leverage the DEI narratives to argue for themselves being minorities. And the subtle layers of kind of inequalities within that are really imperceptible outside of the community. But my sort of being an insider-outsider gives me the sense that if you were to interact with South Asians, caste is a big thing, but it has morphed into, it looks like lots of other things, but it's still that thing. Does that make sense? That many caste scholars, then Mori Sundarajan is one who has written about this, and I would advise, kind of referencing her work. She has shown the direct link between the caste system in South Asia and how it carries over here and globally and gets replicated, and that the anti-blackness we see from South Asian communities in particular is directly rooted in the caste system. So she makes that connection very clear, and I think if I were to remember how she presents it, she would say, yes, the caste system is globally as oppressive as anywhere else. However, the realities are that many of us don't actually reveal our caste when we're in diaspora. But those who know, right? Like, I don't have to out myself for people to really know from my last name where I am in that caste structure. So the thing is, it is a thing. It is always that elephant in the room that is stomping on us, no matter what we're doing as South Asians. And that's my experience. But, I welcome that other people may disagree. But I really do invite us to read Mori Sundarajan's book on it, on caste.
Thank you. Can I make a couple of recommendations to the audience in general? Because I feel like there's a lot of questions that are coming up that I'm sure I have not read either one of your books, but I'm sure that you address them. But there are also, like I said, people that I'm in community with back home, young people who are kind of doing this work. And one of them is actually my best friend who is in the Kuti Collective and is writing a book about indentureship in South Africa, but they have an essay on Africa as a country called The Afterlives of Indenture, and it's a really, really good essay, and I recommend it to everybody in the room. And then I have another friend back home in Kenya called April Zhu, who wrote an essay recently called Bad Witness, What I Didn't Say About Reporting on Chinese Christians in Kenya. And it's kind of like a regret essay about another essay that she wrote that she feels she did a bad job on. And so she revisits it to try and kind of correct what she did. And it's also a really great essay that kind of does center conversations that are not happening necessarily with the West. But also I just find them really useful and instructive because they are young people living on the continent having these conversations that I was asking about earlier. So I just recommend them to everyone here. Yeah.
That's great. That's actually, I think, a great way to end our conversation with recommendations for more reading and more discussion, more connection. We are happy to have the Kuumba singers outside being set up right now, so I invite you all to come out to the foyer out there to enjoy the music. And if we all could just thank our speakers today for coming and giving us talks.
Thank you.